Session 3, Designing Spaces for Healing. And I'm Alan Short. I'm the Professor of Architecture, and I'm also the President of Clare Hall. And I should say thank you very much to Frank Salmon for inviting me along with Elizabeth. The department is absolutely delighted to be associated with this centre. And I can say I had nothing to do with bringing this to Cambridge at all, but I'm very pleased to take some of the credit if it's going. But it's a great development for us. And I should say that in the department we're very interested in the architecture of healthcare, and for a number of years I've led a group investigating the possibility of making completely natural environments in buildings for health, and we spent the last 2 years inventing a new kind of very low carbon, completely natural operating theatre. So we'd love to collaborate with everybody. So our first talk, slight difference to the program, is by Hanna Morichetto, and Hanna is a research and practicing architect with a special focus on residential architecture and health. And very excitingly, she recently defended her PhD thesis, Residential Architecture in Enriched Environments, and she works as a practicing senior lead architect at Liljevalchs Architects in Sweden. And of course she collaborates with researchers, and she teaches at Chalmers University of Technology, Department of Architecture and Civil Engineering in Gothenburg, an institution I think we should get to know rather better. And her talk is called "Can Residential Architecture Constitute a Part of Human EE and Contribute to Recovery, Prevention and Stress Reduction? Ways Forward." Hanna, stage is yours.
Well, first of all, I would start with thanking for inviting me. Thank you very much for the Axon Johnson Foundation and Cambridge University, and of course also Karolinska Institutet. This talk will primarily focus on the results from my thesis, but also raises the question, ways forward, how to take on these exciting questions. I don't really seem to make this work, but I could just mention that during my PhD, I was my professor Ola Nylander from Chalmers was a very important person, of course, as well as my co-supervisor, Professor Hellevik in Caring Sciences at Sahlgrenska, which is another great healthcare institution in Sweden. So, a little bit about today's agenda. I will briefly start about the concept of health, to move on to what represents an enriched environment and why is it important. A little bit about my study design and approach. I won't bore you with a total description of the methods. Primarily, though, talking about the results of the thesis, and then just a few words about an ongoing project at the office where we do residential design on a wooden project, CLT, wooden construction. We were talking yesterday about the benefits of wooden architecture, especially in relation to fire. And in the end, I hope we have time for some discussion and not the least, ways forward. So I would also like to mention a book chapter recently finished, which also was like an outcome of the whole research project which I attended, which my PhD was a part of. It's called Architecture for Residential Care and Aging Communities, and was edited by Sten Gromark and Björn Andersson. And it was part of this AIDA project, which was recently finished, Architectural Interventions for Dwelling, Aging and Healthcare, supported by Swedish research agency Formas, conducted primarily at Chalmers University in Gothenburg, but also including researchers from all over the world, really. The previous speaker mentioned Anfa, and I would also like to encourage you to look at their work. It's an extremely important organization, I think, and I've attended one conference, sending in an abstract for the next one, and also taking part in an education arranged by New School of Architecture. It's like a very interesting hub over there, I think, about when it comes to the relations between architecture and neuroscience. I don't only do this kind of research, but also collaborates with Dr. Anna Breide on social sustainability issues, about adaptability and the way we can use our dwellings over time, and how to construct them in order to that they should be adaptable for different kind of families and over time as needs shift during lifetime. There are certain things we can program our residential structures with as architects, which will enable a good usage of the dwelling. So, what's the concept of health? Yes, I mean, health is a really, really difficult subject, I would say. It's very broad. In the beginning of my studies, I used it, and it was very much too broad to even handle, I would say, in my case. But I want to put forward the WHO definition of health, which hasn't really been altered since 1948, when it was established. The interesting thing about this that they say health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And that's a very, very difficult thing to achieve, and it's been criticized, I would say, for being almost more like a political statement. But what it does is that it identifies the multi-dimensional aspect of health. It's a multi-dimensional definition. And it's not only the absence of disease, which is interesting, and it's also individual experience, which means that you can experience health although you are ill. It all comes to what kind of help you can get in order to handle your situation. So back to my thesis, or the background about physical environment and health and enriched environment. The connection between physical environment and human health is a growing area of research and knowledge. And one way to understand this connection is to study the concept of enriched environments. And that really became a very important aspect or part of this theory for me to work with. And it's very much thanks to Professor Mikael Nilsson, who is he is in the University of Newcastle in Australia. I was sort of searching for a way forward and how to apply my thoughts, what kind of theoretical framework could best serve my studies, and how could I sort of bridge medicine and architecture in a, to me, efficient way. And an enriched environment is something that works both for recovery, prevention, and stress reduction. And this concept has long served as a model for studying the positive effects of the physical environment on mental health. And this happens through the multisensory stimulation created by the enriched environment, which affects the structure and function of the brain. And this is really important because I will later show a slide about neurogenesis, the creation of neurons. But when it comes to enriched environments, we have learned that it is primarily through a reorganization of the neural networks in the brain, and not really the neurogenesis, which benefits most. But more on that later. And in animal models, the concept rests on 3 pillars. It's the physical, the cognitive, and the social stimulation. Yes. So about my thesis, the purpose and aim, it was to explore and describe what a model for enriched environments for humans in the context of the home could look like. And I can say that I'm very lonely in this field. I've really searched the field, and I've had to really move to healthcare architecture and closely related areas because there isn't very much research, and the enriched environment concept is also a very broad one and suffers from a diversity in its definitions. The point of departure is that an enriched environment is positive also for the healthy individual by developing and improving cognitive abilities or counteracting negative stressors. The aim with the thesis was to formulate concepts that describe attributes of the home, creating an enriched environment. And these concepts now can be used for further transdisciplinary research using both qualitative and quantitative methods. So my research question then, what are the concepts and architectural attributes of the home that are important to enriched environment and sensory stimulation? Some theory now. It is a challenge to translate existing animal models. We know it works, but it's still in animal models for enriched environments to a clinical context for humans. But as for animal models, it does mean an environment characterized by multisensory stimulation through physical, cognitive, and social activity and sensory stimulation. Well, how does it work? It all comes down to the brain plasticity, and not so many years ago we thought that the brain didn't have the ability to actually heal and to continue to develop after our birth. But we are born with stem cells, and it's a fascinating organ, really. But as I mentioned before, it's primarily the reorganization of functional networks which is working when it comes to enriched environment. Dr. Fred Gage is a fantastic researcher, I think, and I had the opportunity to listen to him during a lecture. And he says, at another speech or talk, he says this: while the brain controls our behavior and genes control the blueprint for the design and structure of the brain, the environment can modulate the function of the genes and ultimately the structure of our brain. Changes in the environment change the brain, and therefore they change our behavior. In planning the environment in which we live, architectural design changes our brain and our behavior. So that's something very nice and interesting to hear as an architect, but it also creates a huge responsibility, I think. So I quickly mentioned the stem cells before. They make new neurons our whole life. But the number and quality of these new neurons are determined by what you think and what you do. And just to give an example, what they can help us with is, for instance, discriminate between related spaces, places, and events, a kind of memory function. This is a picture showing how new neurons are built or created from the stem cells and how they proliferate, differentiate, and survive, and finally works its way into the existing network. It is, to some extent, a confusing picture because it becomes very obvious that the concept isn't quite clear. What is an enriched environment? Because we see enrichment in the green bar, and that, I won't go into that right now, but you can, the interesting thing about this picture, I think, is that a counteractive factor really is stress. So that's very much importance that we create environments that helps us diminish that. But in my thesis, I haven't only looked at neuroscience, I've also studied a lot of literature. I made a scoping and or mapping review. As I told you, very, very hard to find research literature. But I could, during my searches, identify, this is just illustrated through a simple word cloud, frequently read words and important aspects of the physical environment when it comes to health-promoting environments. Other research that I would like to put to the fore is the results of Patrik Rahn and Ulrika Stigsdotter in 2010. They defined 8 perceived sensory dimensions, primarily working with aspects of green, and how come nature has such positive effects on us, and how it also correlates and cooperates with and has an effect on people depending on their health status. These results have been taken further by Jonathan Stoltz, who recently defended, where he slightly renamed these aspects or sensory dimensions and also put them in opposites, pairs of opposites, which creates like a tension line which you could adapt your depending on your state of mind. You could prefer a more open or sheltered environment, for instance. So creating this opportunity of different spatial qualities is something positive. Anna Bengtsson has also further developed this through a project, Restorative Workplace, which is really interesting because here they take the step from the outside and the green towards the inside of the building and the border between these two, interior and exterior. In Swedish, so it's a little bit difficult to understand maybe. I will also mention very quickly, because it was a great part of my work up till the Licentiate halftime seminar, and that is the concept of atmosphere and philosophical struggled with quite a bit, and but which is very interesting in many ways. And I think there are connections, but it's very difficult to do research with this at the moment. But we all know about Swiss architect Peter Zumthor, and he speaks of atmosphere as something which is a quality in architecture. And what is that? Yeah, he means that this is a situation when the building manages to move him. And the German philosopher Gernot Böhme writes about atmosphere that it can be divided in 3 categories: how it works, how it's created, this instant feeling of something which you can generate subconsciously and very, very quickly. It is about geometric structures and physical constellations. It is about synesthetic properties and social characteristics, which means that a person from a certain culture would experience a space differently to another, depending on what background you have. It is also about the interplay between the person and the space, and of course, it's important what we sort of have experienced before. But there, the design process, or the study process here of the thesis, was everything but a chronological one, a bit chaotic, but it's built up of different studies, which in the end resulted in a few concepts for further investigation. It is a hypothesis-driven thesis, so to speak, which hopefully its results will be carried on and evaluated. I divide my results in 3 main categories: the spatial extension, movement, and materials and detailing. And to start with this, I talk about diverging and converging views, and this is sort of in the horizontal plane. Here we see another. The previous project was, they're all, a lot of them are in Gothenburg and or in Sweden. So I just assume that you haven't seen them before. This is another kind of horizontal and vertical, horizontal spatial extension where the blue marked point, a slight recession in the facade creates another way of viewing. It is about sort of the angle of the view, which could create a sense of space. Extremely important when you construct certain parts of the building, if views are blocked, etc. Yeah. Another kind of spatial extension is the one which is created between the inside and the outside. When it comes to movement, I talk about variation and rhythm, depending on how you can move in the apartment, but also how you can move between the inside and the outside. And a lot of these things can create a sense of space, a sense of a larger home or dwelling than it actually is. Finally, the materials and detailing concept category talks about abstract touch and association. We know very much about the tactile dimensions, but previously was the mirror neurons mentioned, and it all has to do with this. Not only are we affected or we react to other people or animal, but also artifacts. So that gives a very interesting connection to architecture and detailing and things like what is carried, what is being carried in the construction, and how is the window put into the wall and the detailing around that. Wood, of course, is very interesting. I will go very quickly through this. I think my time has come to an end. This is really...
Good afternoon. My name is Cristiana, Caira, and I didn't have the chance to talk to Cambridge to you today, but my presentation is pre-recorded, and hopefully we get the chance to talk to each other in a near future. I am today representing Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, where I am artistic professor and part of CVA, which is the Center for Healthcare Architecture at Chalmers. Half of the time I am teaching and researching in the university, and the other half of my time I am designing hospitals and healthcare architecture at White Architecture in Sweden. I have added here my email address in case you want to get in touch with me after the conference. I would be very pleased if you come back to me with questions or just to get to know each other better. My presentation today is divided in 4 parts. I'm going to give you a very short introduction of what Chalmers and especially what CVA is and does. I'm going to talk about the background and definitions regarding healthcare architecture, some input on processes and methodology from a Swedish perspective, and I'm going to go very shortly through a case study that is newly built in Sweden. So first of all, CVA, which is based at Chalmers, is Center for Healthcare Architecture. It's our national arena for creation, exchange, and dissemination of knowledge about healthcare architecture. It is an academic center, and therefore we conduct research training, and we contribute with bachelor and master studies and professional training within this field. Our research focus are the physical environments and the interaction between healthcare, patients, and architecture. At this webpage here, you can find more information about us. In Sweden, healthcare is organized at regional level, as well as the planning of healthcare facilities. We had in the 70s a national center, which would be responsible for policies and standards. We don't have that anymore, which means knowledge and innovation is created locally in the regions and in the specific projects. And CVA has a very important role as a national center to connect the regions to each other, to collect and also distribute knowledge that is developed in the projects. One of our, for example, tasks is to work with evidence-based concept programs, which are actually programs that collect knowledge from practice and research. And we usually process this knowledge through a multi-professional stakeholders group. These materials are not standards or guidelines, but are sorts of knowledge and inspirations that need to be implemented in the collaborative design process of every single healthcare project. Another product that we work with are reports. In this case, we have collected relevant information and scientific knowledge about evidence-based design and just published a new report that collects circa 250 new studies from the latest 10 years. These are only a few of the things we do at CVA, and I really welcome you to get to know more about us. We are also very well connected with other academic institutions in Europe, and I am personally going to teach at the University College of London next week. So we are very interconnected and very active in research and networking. When it comes to background and definitions, I usually start my master course in healthcare design at Chalmers with this definition, which is a very broad and very holistic definition of health. And it is a rather old definition from the World Health Organization, but it has become very modern today because healthcare is moving very rapidly from the idea that health is taking care of sick people, or healthcare is taking care of sick people in hospitals, to actually a more holistic and preventive approach to health in our society. And I usually say to my students that even if I teach them how to plan hospitals, they might not become healthcare architects, but they might think about health and health perspective even when they plan parks and housing and public buildings and cities, because dealing with health in focus, it's a very important, it's a very crucial element of a sustainable society. And we have seen that so clearly during the pandemic in the last 2 years. Working with healthcare also means providing, being part of the effort of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the number 3. So there are many, many parts of the populations that do actually not have access to healthcare at all, or very poor healthcare. And this is important for us as well, because we live in a global world. And once again, it has been rather clearly during the pandemic how everything is interconnected. Healthcare architecture is architecture, and it should rely on the Vitruvian triad, where all the 3 parts of the architecture are equally important. But in the latest 60 years, it has been the functionality aspects of healthcare architecture have been rather strong or predominant, and it is not of course, strange that it is like that, because healthcare services are very complicated and hospitals need to work very functionally, because lives are saved within these buildings. So the buildings that have been built in the 60s, in the 70s all over Europe do actually look like very rational and very structural buildings, where there is a large focus on separation of flows, zoning, modularity, generality, flexibility. These are two rather different examples from an architectural language point of view, but both of them share the idea of a very functional machine-like hospital. One is the hospital in Varberg, designed by white architect in the 60s, and the other one is one iconic clinicum in Aachen in Germany. So during this period of hospitals relying on functionality, there has been, of course, some exceptions. I usually let my students read a lot about Paimio Sanatorium by Alvaralto, because this hospital, although built in a modernistic era, doesn't look like other hospitals in this period. It has a very strong focus on human experience, and especially the experience of the patient. In the design of the overall building, as well as the design of the patient room, in all details around it, the floor, the window, the desk, and also the wash basin. So here there is a very strong accent and a very strong attention on the humanistic and attractivity of spaces, and how much that can affect the experience of the space by the patients in particular. What happened in 1984, this article is very known by all of us. It's a new era started because it's the first time that someone could actually measure in a quantitative way the way architecture has an impact on our healing and our recovery in a hospital. Something that had been intuitive before, because we have always known, especially we architects, we believe that buildings and the built environment have an impact on how we feel and how we might recover better or feel better. This was the first case someone could measure it and proof it. And from this moment on, of course, we have seen an enormous amount of studies within this field. It is not strange that the evidence-based design is so very well known within the field of healthcare architecture. It also goes very well hand in hand with evidence-based medicine, which is a method used in the medical field. Evidence-based design is very well used, and many people do actually use it as it would be a pack of knowledge, but it's not like that. Evidence-based design is actually a process or a method on how to use in an explicit way current best evidence from research and best practice to take actually informed critical decisions in a project design process together with the users and in a multidisciplinary group. And it's very important that this process needs to be applied in each individual and unique project. Otherwise, we could believe that all projects could look the same wherever they are, but that's not, of course, the case. So what has happened in the development of the hospitals in the latest 10 years is that we have seen there has been a stronger focus on evidence-based design and the relation between the building and the design factors, and how that could impact actually our experience in the building. And one of the latest projects from this mega hospital development in Denmark, designed by Herzog de Meuron and Lauritzen, expresses very clearly the vision of creating something completely new, a building that is scaled to humans, that is integrated in the nature, that is in contrast to everything that we have seen before, and that creates a welcoming and homely atmosphere within itself. So this generation of hospitals has been pushed by, I would say, the research started in the middle of the 80s. How do we deal with healthcare architecture? It is a very complex field. And first of all, I would say the most complicated part of it is to understand that healthcare building in itself is just a physical frame for a service. And this service is in continuous transformation. It is pushed by demographic development, by the chronic burden we see in our society, the healthy aging, the well-being, the user participation, which is stronger and stronger. We have on the other side the development of treatment and diagnostic technologies, the e-health digitalization that is actually pushing out the healthcare from the traditional hospital setting into a network of ecosystems. And then we have the global security. We have staff challenges in all over Europe. We have so many other factors that come into create megatrends and need to be, of course, reflected in the architecture we plan around it, because the architecture is just a physical frame to enable this development and the transformation. And the biggest challenge we have actually is that the services we are planning for are so rapidly changing while the building we plan is physical. And the conflict between a physical static building and a transforming service is, I would say, the most difficult challenge we have as healthcare architects. We do research a lot at Chalmers on future-proofing architecture, especially for hospitals. And I would recommend you to visit Karolinska, New Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm, because this is a perfect school example on how long you can or we can go with future-proofing when it comes to a hospital building. So how do we work and how do we deal with this complex process? In Sweden, we usually say that the process lays on 3 different areas. They are interconnected to each other all the time. On one side, relying on evidence and scientific knowledge that is relevant for the project. On the other side, relating to best practice. They requires a lot of openness and curiosity. And the participatory design or dialogue, which is the only way we have to include all the different stakeholders, from staff to users to patients, but also other engineering and multidisciplinary teams into these very complex projects, and to come as long as we can do in every single project. So how do we do that, and how can that be implemented in a specific project? I would like to give this example of the mental health clinic in Borås. It has won several prizes this year. It's just opened 1 year ago. And it's a project that I've been following as a lead architect from the architecture competition in 2010 to the opening last year. First of all, when the project started, the trust and the hospital wrote down a strategic vision document. And in this vision document, there was a very clear model of care that would be developed, patient-centered model of care, but also there was a very clear ambition on how the architecture in the building would actually support the model of care. And this is something that not all projects have. Most projects start with a very clear vision on how the healthcare will be provided, but not so very clear idea on how architecture would be related to that. And this is for me a case of success of a project, to interrelate the architecture with the vision of care that is within the building. We had at White Architecture just concluded a very big hospital project just before this project, a mental health clinic, where we could have, we had after that a post-occupancy evaluation, and we saw very clearly an interconnection between some specific design factors and the outcomes that were a reduction of stress, reduction of aggression, and a much better work environment for staff. This research was also developed at Chalmers by Professor Roger Ulrich, that at that time was visiting professor, and it's available on the internet, of course, to look at. It's called Psychiatric Ward Design Can Reduce Aggressive Behavior. This research, together with other relevant research, has been following the project during the whole period of 10 years, from very strategic decisions at the beginning to the end, on very specific design decisions in the construction drawings, etc. Another important element in this project has been participatory design. We have been interacting with staff, all professions, as well as users. And in this case, mental health patients can represent very different diagnosed groups or patient groups, and might have different expectations on what the building design should look like, because they have different needs, and sometimes they are contrasting to each other, and that has been so extremely an extremely good process for us to learn and to understand. So through design and research and through best practice and in dialogue with the users, we agreed on 7 design principles. And these 7 design principles, where the central one is destigmatizing mental health by normalizing through architecture, have been following this project all over the 10 years we have been planning and building. So first of all, it was an ambition to break down the silos between mental and physical health, bring mental health into the hospital campus, and make the mental health clinic exactly as one of the clinics in the hospital, to break down or take away the stigma around it. So the clinic is in a hospital campus next to the infection clinic, the inner clinic, in a medical clinic, and it is shaped as a star building to enable daylight and gardens to come all the way inside the building and to be at the same time extroverted to the nature around. The entrance hall is a low building, a very welcoming entrance that should feel like an open and public room, open to everyone. Also, because we wanted to take away the stigma around mental health. So if you enter the entrance hall, here, the strategic decision was to use the most of the area of the entrance hall for the campus facilities of the hospital. So when you enter this, you can be a patient, you can be a relative, you can be a staff, you can be a conference center visitor, you can be a teacher and a student. And nobody needs to be afraid or to be ashamed to enter this building. So there was a very clear and very consequent decision taken to destigmatize, normalize mental health through architecture. The entrance hall is also has a large focus on orientation and daylight, and also is built in timber, given the idea that we would use as much as possible of wood and natural materials for salutogenic aspects. For a good orientation, it is important that the central staircase is in a good position with reach in daylight and easy to find. And this glass box that was there only for safety reasons has become the most important art piece within the building. It is called Every Color You Are, which is a symbol for a mental health clinic. The day rooms in this building are inspired with the idea of letting the outdoor space come into the inside and the opposite. So we have plenty of daylight, we have possibility to go out and get fresh air, and we have plenty of natural materials surrounding us, also giving the chance to interact in smaller social spaces or in large ones. And at the end, the patient room, which is the oasis for the patient, your private sphere where you feel the most vulnerable. You can go back to yourself, be alone. Every single room has a balcony where you can have fresh air. And this room has been a gigantic challenge between safety and healing. And we decided together with the client that when there is a conflict between safety and healing, the healing would prevail, because there is evidence that when the architecture is shaped for controlling and for safety, that might trigger most aggression and most risky situation than the opposite. So once again, in all these decisions that we have been taking during the project, we have been relying on scientific knowledge. We have had a client that was open for best practice and research, but also open for new solutions that haven't been tested before. And we have been working very closely to the users. And now, 1 year after moving in, the time in the hospital, the stay has been reduced very much, and also the sick leave of staff is drastically reduced. So I'm very happy to hear that the efforts have been leading to a very, very good solutions for both patients and staff. And we will now do our studies as soon as we can enter the building after the pandemic to learn even more about how architecture and health are connected to each other. I am finished with my presentation. It has been a very big pleasure for me to contribute to this symposium today. And as I said at the beginning, I am pleased to, if you want to get in touch with me in the future and learn more about each other. Thank you very much.
Well, 15 minutes is not very long, so forgive me if I just go straight into the presentation. It must have been 10 years ago that Gerald Grosvenor, the late 6th Duke of Westminster, was considering the legacy he might leave behind, and having dedicated much of his life to the territorial army, and with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan raging, he decided that it was time that the military had a new rehabilitation centre for treating badly injured service personnel. The Duke instinctively knew that it was not enough that the new Defence Rehabilitation Centre should be equipped to provide the latest treatment rehabilitation medicine had to offer. He wanted the architecture to be such that the young men and women, some with appalling injuries, returning from the war, would immediately feel that this is a place in which they would be really cared for. The DMRC, therefore, as a medical facility, it's not working. Yeah. So there we are. These are some slides of the DMRC, just to show what I mean. Anyway, so the DMRC, therefore, as a medical facility, is quite unique today in that it was designed with the express intention of making the architecture of the buildings play its part alongside medicine in the process of healing patients. Having said that, this is not by any stretch of the imagination the first time that this has been done. As you've heard today, before the advent of modernism in the 20th century, a long and successful tradition existed. To name but a few such hospitals that represent this tradition are James Gibbs Buildings at Barts in the City of London, that you see here, and John Nash's former St. George's Hospital at Hyde Park Corner. The exciting thing, as we've also heard, is how research in the neurosciences is now making a link between well-being and architecture, and that our immune systems are preconditioned through evolution to respond to specific environmental patterns. This is reinforcing the validity of the architectural models developed through that historic tradition, whose origins stretch back to antiquity, as you see in this surviving frieze from the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, and then subsequently brought down to us through the monastic communities of the Middle Ages who cared for the sick. And it's easy to see just how the old monastic infirmaries, designed around garden courts, surrounded by cloisters and colonnades, created a sanctuary of peace and tranquility away from the stress and anxiety of everyday life, and why this would have played its part in restoring sick patients to health. The hospitals that come down from this tradition, as Barts and the old Guy's Hospital in London, clearly took their form around green cloistered courts derived from their monastic predecessors. The DMRC picks up on this and on this tradition of medical architecture, and is located on a site especially selected within an established parkland setting of a former 18th century country house at Stamford Hall near Loughborough. Needless to say, there would have been little point spending such effort searching out such a unique site if by adding 400,000 square feet of new hospital buildings we destroyed the Arcadian character that made it so attractive in the first place. The centre, therefore, takes the form of a series of interlinked buildings. This made it possible to vary the character and maintain the scale so as to create the right environment for the patients and allow the new buildings to remain in harmony with the surviving estate and surrounding parkland. Like many hospitals, the DMRC is made up of many elements. These have been clustered together in groups, and there are also several large-scale spaces, such as specialist gyms, you see one there, and physiotherapy treatment pools, as well as large various high-tech equipment that is now used in rehabilitation, such as the Karen, which is a simulator and is a virtual environment where patients with new prosthetic limbs relearn how to do things like ski or climb a mountain. Then there are the industrial-type workshops for making prosthetic limbs, and of course the more conventional hospital spaces, such as trauma wards, specialist treatment areas, outpatients and radiology departments, and residential scale accommodation for staff, and the back-to-life facilities where patients and their families are prepared for the changes that they will have to face when they return home. In this way, the arrangements of the DMRC buildings and the location of the new courts were designed to follow the organizational pattern of the old estate, so that the surviving features, such as the old stable court and the walled garden and Stamford Hall, could be easily integrated into the new design. The large spaces, such as the gyms, were deliberately designed to stand out and be recognizable, much as a chapel would in a college setting, making the center a much easier place for a new patient to get to know, relying on their intuitive skills for orientation and finding their way around. The result is a deliberately picturesque architectural composition with a convenient and pleasing environment, providing a variety of different places for the patient, which is also practical and flexible for the staff. It's also forgiving for additions and alterations that might be subsequently made should the need arise. This is important for any medical facility, as who can predict what may be required as new treatments evolve. Moreover, with a military rehabilitation facility like this, the casualties that it will have to deal with will depend entirely on the type of conflict that the military are involved with. As such, it's designed to allow for a much greater than normal internal adaptability between departments as patient types will vary and technology changes. The beauty of traditional architecture, too, is that you can draw on a particular version of that tradition, rather like a dialect in language, and assert ownership and identity. In this case, many of the buildings have been deliberately designed with a robust military utility, using brick detailing for the architecture in preference to the stone dressings, picking up the military tradition that goes back to Christopher Wren's Chelsea Hospital and Hawksmoor's Academy building for the Royal Artillery at Woolwich. This is intended to evoke a sense of familiarity and belonging and pride that would immediately be recognized and give comfort to the vulnerable patients as they arrive at the DMRC. In our submission for the Wolfson Economics Prize last year, planning and designing the hospital for the future, we set out together with Create Streets and Ruggles Mabe Studio and others to identify the criteria that need to be incorporated in a design for a hospital to become a place of healing. The intention with our submission was to create a pattern book that can be used to allow all parties involved in creating hospitals to engage and deliver medical facilities that are appropriate to their needs and the needs of the community that they serve, but based on a holistic approach to human well-being. We called it the Complete Hospitals Framework. Go back. We identified 7 key components: green with gardens and the connection with nature, which we've heard quite a bit about and is central to this tradition; the cloister and a sense of sanctuary and safety; the importance of sunlight and fresh air. Apart from food and water, sunlight and air are essential ingredients to life; the need to be in a beautiful place that will inspire and lift the spirits; with an architecture that patients are comfortable in and is familiar and that they can understand. And of course, it's got to be functional, adaptable, and resilient. And it needs to be part of a community. When you're sick, you don't want to be far away from family and friends. Then, for each of these components, we've in turn identified a series of specific architectural patterns. These draw on the old tradition of medical architecture and are based on an increasingly robust empirical understanding of what is good for patients, for staff, for visitors, and for the neighborhoods which hospitals serve. I'm not intending to go through the whole list. You want me to? As an example, if we consider the circulation routes through a hospital, these, as in most buildings, define the first experience you get. In most, these are places that would be especially well considered during the design process and are very thoroughly choreographed architecturally. In a hospital, this is even more significant as it helps give patients a pleasant experience, welcoming them into the building. It's also essential in drawing the all-important green courts into the everyday experience of the hospital to benefit patients, staff, and visitors. The way the routes are configured with open or terminated views at the end, how they integrate with the green courts either side, and what use the green spaces are given, are all very significant, so that the courts don't become, as they do in most hospitals today, simply decorative, with the odd plant outside perhaps to be enjoyed from afar. Horticultural therapy is becoming increasingly popular, or as at the DMRC, some external spaces were designed to incorporate different surfaces for patients to use to practice with their prosthetic limbs. Circulation, too, can be arranged to provide alternative routes which can take you through open spaces to encourage staff and patients, if so inclined, to enjoy the courts, even if it may only be for a short while on their way from one part of the hospital to another. Stairs, too, should be given prominence over lifts and placed strategically so as to connect the upper floors with the green outdoor space. Windows, too, are significant and can be a lifeline for patients who can't get outside, a condition many patients may experience for a good part of their recuperation. A view is important, but a window is much more. It provides access to sunlight and air that patients can control themselves and can be an attractive place combined with somewhere to sit that invites the patient to enjoy the outside world. Finding your way around any hospital these days is invariably something of a nightmare. But why is this? People in general are very good at recognizing patterns and intuitively finding their way around places that they're not familiar with, but not in a hospital. We know, for instance, when looking at a profile of an Italian hill town, like this one, that if you want the market square, you'd be better advised to head for the Campanile rather than go for the fortified tower of the castle. Everyone visiting St. John's won't take long to find the hall or the chapel, or if they know which staircase they need to go to, they know in which direction to head simply by following the alphabet sequence. By having a pattern that's recognizable, the architectural variety within that contains the clues that help us find our way around. This is a straightforward process that most of us actually enjoy as something of a satisfying and entertaining puzzle that confirms our intelligence. We know that all buildings or settlements have grown through a process of accretion, so the different architectural styles guide us through an otherwise unfathomable maze. This is why, when that variety turns out to be arbitrary, that we're left disorientated. The variety that could be useful and engaging, having lost its significance, becomes a misleading and tedious distraction that leaves us feeling cheated. these are a few examples of the patterns that we've identified as part of the complete hospitals framework. They're not intended to replace design, but to guide the process, to help those involved in commissioning, managing, and designing healthcare buildings, to shift the balance towards the patients. And we've spoken so far about design within hospital buildings. But what about the form that they should take? And how should they respond to the context that they're in and the requirements of the community that they serve? We all know hospitals are inherently different. They could be large or small, multidisciplinary or specialized, set in a small town, metropolitan centers, or rural locations. As part of our Wolfson Economics Prize submission, we put together an outline design for a hypothetical Barchester hospital, which illustrates how the application of the very same patterns used at the DMRC would look like if applied to a new acute hospital. In a city, for instance, take Bath, with buildings about 4 to 5 stories high. Bath. Many of the patterns applied to the Barchester Hospital may well result in a design that's familiar and similar to the DMRC. Each of the blocks contains an enclosed green court, for instance, the way the circulation works at the ground floor and integrates those courts, maybe a variation of the DMRC. But as these are taller buildings, there will be differences, and it may be useful to introduce more green garden space on the roof. The significant difference, however, will be how the hospital integrates with the surrounding community and with its physical urban surroundings. The Barchester Hospital would need to fit into a surrounding urban structure, which we've assumed to be that of a medium-sized town or city with a typical urban block size of around 70 to 90 meters. And incorporating buildings of a scale of having 20-meter frontages and perhaps 4 stories high. The sort of facility it's likely to be is a 700-bed hospital with a catchment of around 500,000 people, perhaps older than the UK average, with an expected higher need for cancer specialists. The outcome, as you see here, and as you would expect, would be very different. It will encompass several urban blocks, which probably wouldn't be very far from the center of town. It's designed here with an entrance through a distinctive building on the square, which is an important green public space at the center of the hospital, around which the circulation is arranged. The various hospital buildings could have separate entrances to different departments directly from the street, making them easier to find. The urban blocks would be linked together with bridges on the upper levels and at basement level below, retaining the permeability of the streets and allowing other uses such as shops to be integrated within the hospital, and for the hospital to engage at street level with the surrounding townscape, linking it seamlessly to surrounding streets. In the case shown here, an adjacent tree-lined boulevard and an urban square. This way, the hospital contributes to the urban structure of the city, benefits from the connections with public transport, and can operate as an integral part of the surrounding community. It's perhaps not all that remarkable that the buildings that the 20th century saw fit to strip most of their humanity were hospitals and buildings designed to care for the sick. I hope some of the work that we're doing today will go some way to restore a more caring and healthy world in which to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Samuel Hughes, University of Oxford. So it's a question, I think, in the first instance for John, but probably for all the panelists. So I'm just, looking at these designs, and one is obviously struck that, say, Barchester Hospital looks more like the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, or indeed like the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan that was mentioned earlier today, than it does like a lot of the hospitals made in the lifetimes of the people in this room. And we've seen some of the reasons why that might be so. But I was sort of interested in working on Barchester Hospital or on other hospitals that have been discussed today. What are the ways in which it's changed since the 19th century? So what are the opportunities that you have exploited, or what are the fresh challenges that have come up that would make Barchester Hospital different to the hospitals of 19th century London or Paris?
Well, technology is different. And again, what you're doing with a hospital is today is serving a community which is around it. So the whole concept of a hospital and what it delivers and all that sort of thing is very different from what it was in the 19th century. We have a health service today, so you're dealing with something completely different. I mean, you've got walk-in clinics, you've got all sorts of things like this, which probably didn't exist before. It was much more you went to hospital, and the hospital was a much more formal place you went to. So it's not the same thing, and it's being reorganized over and over again. I mean, that's the other, I suppose, difficulty. They just won't stand still. And they keep changing the names of the things, They don't call wards now, I think. But anyway, I think they still do. But most things, they sort of give them new names, so you don't really quite know what they're talking about. But essentially, it's you're trying to make things fit in within the context they're in, and at the same time, trying to humanize the whole process within that.
So Hanna, I was going to ask, do you recognise in John's healthcare buildings some of the principles that you were telling us about?
Definitely, yes.
I hesitate to mention the word atmosphere. We're very interested in atmospheres.
Yeah.
In the department.
Yeah, I could see many connections, and for instance, the views, the spatial, the diverging and converging views, as I was talking about, and there's a lot to say about the importance of windows, for instance, which could inspire for getting out. For some people who tend to forget the possibility of moving outside, they can benefit from being reminded of that opportunity. There is a lot of things that the physical environment could do to stimulate a good behavior, or something that will heal you in the end. But I would also like to add that the research project AIDA, which I was mentioning before, actually dealt with the future caring situation, which will not only take place at the hospital, but even in the home, and all the kind of institutions or places where care will happen in between, like smaller centers, etc., but also in the home. So yes, the hospital, although I'm not a hospital architect, I could say that where care will be conducted, that has shifted and will continue to do so.
So shall we ask the audience for views of what constitutes this the magic ingredient of atmosphere that characterises a memorable, an enhanced environment over and above the kind of everyday pedestrian architecture that we see? What do people think? Yes.
Well, atmosphere can be generated by space, but one of the things, of course, that characterizes John's work is the use of ornament. And the ornament, of course, is biomorphic, it's biophilic by its nature, because classical architecture is all based on plant and animal forms. So we have in your hospital lots and lots of rich biophilic kinds of ornament that will provide that sort of atmosphere, which I'm afraid is often not found in buildings that don't have ornament. And ornament is fundamental to great buildings, but of course modern architecture has little or no ornament, and so I think the spaces that are kind of vacuous and just plainer are not going to give that sort of approachability that Don Ruggles talked about. And I think, of course, you can, of course, make ornament on walls. You can make it with plants, but I think if you make it integral to the building, it's going to be more powerful, more atmospheric.
And the theme of the event, in a way, is that the classical language of architecture provides a sort of palette, category that is available to everyone, but is to a large extent being ignored in the text.
Let me add a very quick thought on what it doesn't include. So space is one of the great red herrings of architectural discourse. There's a marvellous section in one of Roger Scruton's books, which I'm about to misquote, which says that when you think about it, there's as much space in a field as there is in a major cathedral. The difference is that in a major cathedral contains and encloses the space, and it's in the enclosure rather than the space that the beauty and indeed the dignity is contained.
Space, time and architecture. First year reading list. There you are. Yes. Oh, it's another question. Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that what makes this atmosphere, so to say. I think it is the combination of, as you have talked a lot about from the Swedish perspective, both of you, the scientific knowledge about what is needed, but we didn't hear enough about the connection with history and art. And art is what is beautiful, and that includes ornament, of course. So the connection between history and science, there is some missing link, I think, not least in Sweden, because it's kind of forbidden to do that connection, and it can be done in so many ways. But if we don't even try, how can we succeed? And I think that has also to do with this about hospitals having the problem with that the buildings are static while technology and knowledge, scientific knowledge is going on. But why not think about that historic buildings are not static. Therefore, many of them stay for many hundreds of years, because they are flexible. I would like just to see what you say about that.
It's so interesting you use the word forbidden, because I just reflected, in fact, 30 years ago it would be very difficult for me to attend this event. A lot of criticism in the department. Those days are gone. Yes.
Just in terms of ornament and in terms of classicism and modernism, I just want to make a point. I'm a champion of ornament, I should say, but I think today we have seen buildings which are modernist buildings. We've seen that wonderful Paimio Sanatorium by Alvar Aalto. We've seen some wonderful buildings in Sweden, which are not classical buildings and which do not employ ornament. So I don't think it's very helpful actually to demonize modernism. And I think it's important to say that atmosphere is produced by the quality of the design. I think, and also, I suppose one of the questions that I would have had for John in looking at this wonderful array of parts, a budget, of course, is hugely important, and the amount of money that society is prepared to invest in architecture. And so we get these awful cost accountant buildings as a result of an attitude as much as a particular mode of design. So I just wanted to say that I think it's important to appreciate quality of design in different ways of making buildings.
Well, talking to a hospital contractor, in fact, wasn't a consultant, was a contractor. He told me that when he'd built something, he was asked to take it down and build it in another way because it looked too expensive. There is an element that people are worried that they might be accused of building something expensive because it's healthcare, and deliberately make it look like it's cheap and utilitarian. That's the thing we've got to get out of. I think a lot of these hospitals are built deliberately that way. It's the other way round. What's got to happen is that's got to be shed. That attitude has got to be shed. And there's absolutely no reason why ordinary people for whom these hospitals are built can't be made to be nice and enjoyable places. You know, the windows don't have to be sealed shut and don't have to look the way they do. They can look a lot nicer because a window frames a view and it allows you access to the outside, not just a piece of glass that allows you to look out. I mean, it's these sort of things, and a lot of these things don't cost money. It's what Don Ruggles was saying. Beauty is free, just like color on walls is free, because it costs you the same to paint it in a white or paint it in beige or red, you know, and it's the same thing, you know, it's just putting the effort into it, being thoughtful, and that's what all these patterns that I was talking about are. It's a matter of actually putting forward a series of patterns to force people to actually consider those things and say why they're doing them the way they're doing them, and why don't they make them better? Why don't they make them so that they're thoughtful? I mean, it might not cost more to actually have a little window seat at the bottom of every window rather than not.
My instruction was to bring things to an end at 6.
We
could ignore that and keep going.
Alan, I've got four more people wanting to ask questions.
I'm going to ignore the instruction.
But maybe I could just respond.
Maybe if we have one more, we can have a short break, and we do have a reception waiting for us downstairs. And we can continue the discourse. But why don't we have one more question, and we'll have a short break.
Excellent compromise. And college catering team, you definitely don't want to know.
No.
So who is the last question? Okay, excellent.
Well, thank you for the presentations. I was thinking about the question of atmosphere relating also to quality and what you're talking about, both of you, the patterns which you're trying to pinpoint consists of small bits and pieces, characteristics, but when it comes to atmosphere, it's the way you put them together. Because I mean, here in your this beautiful hospital, I would love to live there. I wouldn't just want to stay there when I was sick. You showed how, like greenery, for example, or a window, someone else could put that piece of greenery, but in a much uglier way. I mean, it's not just having the greens, it's like the combination, and that's the architectural quality, the aesthetic quality that creates the atmosphere. And I think that's a question of a pattern or a symmetry. Yeah.
You still have to design it.
The question is, can you teach that to young architects? And I think you can. Yes. So, are we going to call it a day then?
Well, we're going to call it a break. So we'll if we just take a 5-minute comfort break, and then we'll come back here and we'll have a 15-minute panel discussion with Peter Valentine, Nicholas Boyd-Smith, and then champagne is waiting for us downstairs afterwards. So we'll be back here at
But to be quite clear, the doors will be locked. So you
6:07.
can't get champagne.
6:07. That clock is fast.
Thank you very much.
No.